It's my pleasure as director of the Cardinal Bea Center to open this evening dedicated to Abraham Heschel. Abraham Heschel, who passed away 50 years ago on the 23rd of December 1972. So Archbishop Morandi just told me at the beginning that not only was it, from a Christian point of view, just the night before Christmas, but it was also Shabbat. So a particular double blessing in a certain way. The theme that we chose was shaped by the other. We will see in what way Abraham Heschel allowed us to enter into a situation in which Jewish-Christian relations were not only a question of dialogue, but were a question of allowing ourselves to be transformed, deeply transformed by the tradition and the richness of the other. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to the rector of the Gregorian University, Rector Magnifico, Mark Lewis.
Your Excellencies, speakers for tonight's presentation, esteemed professors and students, friends all. The Brenningmeier Verhan Lecture, of which this is the 21st, is always one of my favorite events at the Pontifical Gregorian University, even though I've not been able to make it all the way through these lectures since becoming an administrator, since we have meetings on Tuesday evenings. You might ask why this is one of my favorites, and certainly other organizers of events will probably ask me. And I would say I enjoy it because of the spirit of joy and friendship that permeates this event. That comes in great part from the academic quality of the evening, which leaves all of us learning something very useful for our lives. So I wish to welcome first our esteemed guests, Mrs. Carolyn Weijers, Ambassador of the Netherlands to the Holy See, Mr. Raphael Schutz, Ambassador of Israel to the Holy See, Mrs. Emily Zeeberg, Public Affairs Officer of the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See. The work here this evening is important for all of us, and we thank you for your interest and your support here. I also welcome Rabbi Ariel Stoffenmacher, Rector of the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano de Buenos Aires. After meeting with him yesterday, I am sure we have a great deal in common. Among the friends that we have here from the Hebrew University, I welcome Professor Oded Irshai, former director of the Center for the Study of Christianity at Hebrew University. And I also welcome among our speakers, Professor Benjamin Pollock from Hebrew University. Professor Susanna Herschel of Dartmouth College, welcome to our university. Heschel, how did I miss that? Anyway, very much. And we also welcome among the clergy, Monsignor Alberto Boschete, who is Secretary of the Argentinian Bishops' Conference, and one of our speakers here, Archbishop Giacomo Morandi, Bishop of Reggio Emilia Guastalla, bentornato a sua alma mater. I would also like to greet in a special way Mrs. Brenningmeier. I always look forward to our visits and being with her and covering a great deal of things about the Centro Bea on this day before all of the lectures begin. It's wonderful to have friends who are dedicated and involved in the improvement of our university and who always act from a sense of mission and love for the work that we are called to do. On behalf of the university and all of us here to attend this lecture, I thank you for that support and dedication that continues to improve the center and our university. Our commitment, of course, comes from the desire to strengthen relationships between Jews and Christians in our contemporary world. This is a commitment that grows in its depth every time we meet. There is so much to be done, and there is a deep joy in doing it. The mission of improving our mutual understanding, reciprocal trust, and friendship now leads us to reflect in new ways on how we can improve our common home and reflect and develop our identity as Fratelli Tutti, two images often heard from Pope Francis, and which I think is also reflected in the title to tonight's presentation, Shaped by the Other. In fact, by allowing ourselves to be formed by our relationships with others from other cultures and other traditions, we should not reject anything that is true and is holy, as Pope Francis suggested last week to the World Jewish Congress. We move forward in this task here tonight in the midst of challenges in our world and in our communities. But we move forward with hope, hope that brings joy. Our religious communities, each of our religious communities, celebrate light in this season where it is dark very early. What can be a better way of witnessing to that hope which guides us in our endeavors, which requires us to commit ourselves to not getting discouraged, but to open new and creative ways of dialogue. In this context, it is a great honor to have you all with us, and I wish you all a wonderful experience of sharing and being shaped by one another. Thank you.
Thank you for these words of encouragement. We really do hope that this conference will take part and bring a bit of light in this moment. And now I'm very happy we've been collaborating with the Hebrew University, but also with the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano. I hope my pronunciation is okay. And we're happy to have the rector of the seminary with us, Rabbi Ariel Stoffenmacher.
Good evening to everybody. Erev Tov, buenas tardes a todos. Inne ma tov u'ma na'im shevet achim gam yachad. How good, how pleasant that we, brothers and sisters, can sit together and learn from each other. On behalf of the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano Marshall T. Meyer, I want to thank the Pontifical Gregorian University and its authorities for their friendship and their fraternal work, especially the rector, Mark Lewis, and the director of the Bea Center, Father Etienne Beton. You know that the Seminario was founded just 60 years ago, only 60 years ago, by one of the foremost disciples of Abraham Yeshua Heschel, which was Rabbi Marshall T. Meyer. The entire spiritual and academic life of the Seminario is permeated by the spirit of Heschel, his life example and his teachings. So it is an honor for us to meet here in Rome, celebrating his life and work of Heschel on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his passing and in the context of our celebration of the Heschel year launched by the Seminario a year ago. It is also another momentous moment because this is the first activity in which we present to the world our new Abarbanel University, which will begin its activities next year. Heschel was a tireless fighter for human rights, both in the battle for civil rights for African Americans and his opposition to the war of Vietnam. The image of his legs praying when he marched in Alabama with Martin Luther King has become iconic. His vocation for interreligious dialogue was deep and was reflected in his epoch-making essay, No Religion is an Island. Likewise, Heschel's vision and guidance were essential during the Second Vatican Council in the development of Nostra Aetate, together with Cardinal Agustin Bea. Heschel's Hasidic spirit and prophetic vision renewed Jewish and non-Jewish spiritual life and laid bare the depth of the human soul, illuminating new ways of approaching God in our generations. His work about the Shabbat opened doors to an appreciation of the sanctity of time. Heschel's influence has been immense throughout the world, and particularly in our region, Latin America, where the seminario has spread his teachings and its rabbis honor his legacy, defending the rights of the most vulnerable, creating bridges with all communities of faith, and promoting universal ethical values in the public space. We are hopeful that this shared task between the Seminario and the Gregorian University will bear fruits, and we are confident that the opportunities of the joint work are endless. I'm honored also to be here with our dear friend, Professor Susanna Heschel, which honored us not long ago with a visit in Latin America, in Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires. I also want to thank our most strong sponsor and supporter, Pope Francis, who asked us to do this, and that's what we are doing, for encouraging us in this path. And to finish, I want you all to accompany me in saying a blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sheheyanu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed be the Lord, our God, King of the universe, who gave us life, sustained us, and allowed us to reach this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Stoffenmacher, for reminding us of the relationship between the personal relationship between Cardinal Bea and Heschel. That really gives meaning to what we're doing together, and of course for the final blessing. What we will now do is enter into the conference itself. We will have 3 speakers in a row, each one 25 minutes. And then we will have a moment for questions and dialogue. So keep your questions, prepare them, and we will finish around 7 p.m. That will be the timeline. So we start with Professor Benjamin Pollack from the Hebrew University. Professor Pollack is Sol Rosenblum Associate Professor of Jewish Philosophy at the Hebrew University. He's teaching at the Department of Jewish Thought. And he became the director of the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Center in 2017. And he was also the chair of the Department of Jewish Thought for 2 years, from 20 to 22. Professor Pollack is a specialist of Rosenzweig, among other things, but we're really happy that he accepted to be shaped by Heschel, but open up also to a presentation on Abraham Heschel.
Rector Fra Lewis, Rector Rabbi Stoffenmacher, His Excellency Monsignor Morandi, Ms. Brenninkmeyer-Verhan, Professor Heschel, Professor Vito, distinguished guests from all over the world. It's an honor to be here this evening for the Brenninkmeyer-Verhan lecture in commemoration of Abraham Joshua Heschel on the 50th anniversary of his death. In December 1929, a nearly 23-year-old Abraham Heschel published a sequence of 4 poems in the influential Yiddish journal Die Zukunft. The first of these poems, Gott geht mir noch umetum, God follows me everywhere, depicts a vivid experience of the presence of God. And I quote the poem. God follows me everywhere, spins a net of glances around me, shines upon my sightless back like a sun. God follows me like a forest everywhere. My lips, always amazed, are truly numb, dumb, like a child who blunders upon an ancient sanctuary. God follows me within, like a shiver everywhere. My desire is for rest. The demand within me is rise up. See how visions are scattered in the streets, end quote. In these first 3 stanzas of the 5-stanza poem, God's presence is described as enveloping the poem speaker like a forest or net of glances. God's presence is intimate, like a shiver from within. It's ineffable, silencing the speaker's speech. It awakens demands of the speaker when he wishes for rest. But perhaps the most salient feature of Heschel's poem is the way it depicts the experience of being the object of the divine gaze. What Heschel describes is no face-to-face or I-thou relationship with God, but rather what it would be like to feel God looking at me. The opening stanza captures this element distinctly, describing God's gaze as shining upon my sightless back like a sun. What more concrete way is there to imagine myself, my I, my subjectivity as object, than to picture myself viewed from behind? This depiction of being the object of God's gaze unfolds further in the closing two stanzas of the poem, which I'm going to read now. I go with my daydreams as with a secret in a long corridor through the world, and sometimes I glimpse high above me the faceless face of God. God follows me in tramways, in cafes. Oh, it is only with the backs of the pupils of one's eyes that one can see how secrets come into being, how visions happen. When the speaker of the poem periodically looks up in the middle of life seeking God, the fourth stanza suggests, God's face is effaced, becomes faceless. But the final stanza charts the most dramatic trajectory of vision the speaker experiences. If he had first conceived of God's gaze shining upon his back, he now follows the path of God's vision. He reverses his own sight in order to peer through the backs of his own pupils to catch God's gaze, as it were, and then, implicitly turning his glance forward again, to track the actualization of divine vision, the revelation of divine secrets now before him. The implication is that the fulfillment of such secrets occurs through the speaker's own actions, for it is he who carries such secrets in the, quote, long corridor through the world, end quote. Morton Leifman and Ariel Evan Meise have noted that God follows me everywhere foreshadows a central message of Heschel's mature theology, captured in the title of his God in Search of Man. And that is that the direction of the divine-human relationship runs first from God to the human being, that we are first and foremost objects of God's providence, and only on the basis of such objectivity are we granted the potential, and hence are we commanded, to become agents of divine providence in the world. In my time this evening, I'd like to explore key facets of the theology Heschel develops out of this insight into the human being's identity as object of God's gaze, and thus to show how Heschel's celebrated mid-century writings develop the core experience depicted in God Follows Me Everywhere. After noting the centrality of the motif of divine subjectivity in Heschel's writings, I focus on two aspects of the human side of this theology. I examine Heschel's mature accounts of the experience of being an object of divine subjectivity, and how that experience entails the effacement of human selfhood. Then I show how Heschel conceives of the religious human agency that comes to replace the human being's conventional selfhood as an extension of the divine subjectivity in the world. After looking at these two sides of Heschel's account of human experience before God, I highlight one exemplary discussion in which Heschel describes prayer as a spiritual exercise through which a person experiencing herself as the object of God's gaze becomes an extension of divine subjectivity. Much as I've suggested, the speaker in Heschel's early poem tracks the line of the divine gaze from his own back forward, finding the actualization of its secrets in the realm of his own activity. What I offer in this paper is a reading of Heschel's account of human objectivity and agency in the light of divine subjectivity. I have not engaged in a comparative or historical study, and in particular, time restrictions prevent me from spelling out the way I see Heschel's account of the direction of the divine-human relationship as standing in conversation with a central motif in Christian theology. I'm thinking of the account of a divine subject so concerned with the world and the people living in it that this God endures self-humbling and indeed self-sacrifice for the sake of the objects of that concern. And then of the human act of self-humbling called for in imitation of, and perhaps in extension of, this divine self-humbling. But I hope we may have some time to explore this connection in our discussion. In his 1951 Man is Not Alone, Heschel suggests that one arrives at the notion of God as quintessential subject as a result of the failure to grasp God in the terms of our experience of objects in the world. I quote, "Thinking of God is totally different from thinking about all other matters. To think of things means to have a concept within the mind, while to think of Him is like walking under a canopy of thoughts, like being surrounded by thought. We often fail in trying to understand Him," Heschel continues, "not because we do not know how to extend our concepts far enough, but because we do not know how to begin close enough. To think of God is not to find Him as an object in our minds, but to find ourselves in Him," end quote. As Heschel spells out in these passages, we come to know things in the world by extending our network of concepts so as to domesticate these things under the terms that our minds dictate. But the intellectual tools we use to make sense of the world do not bring us closer to an understanding of God. And not because our concepts don't extend far enough, but rather, Heschel insists, because grasping God requires a completely different starting point from that of grasping things. Thinking of God is not the thinking of an object that is very, very far away, but rather, in terms that echo the forest imagery of God follows me everywhere, thinking of God is like being surrounded by divine thought. Much as St. Anselm informs us in his Proslogium that he arrived at his unique proof of God's existence precisely out of despair over grasping God through the typical paths of knowledge, so Heschel recognizes it is only by beginning closer to God than our concepts allow that he may attain a proper grasp of the divine. This train of thought leads Heschel to the following conclusion, I quote, "Thinking of God is made possible by His being the subject and by our being His object," end quote. Now, this notion that the starting point for thinking of God is taking God as the subject of a thought or experience of which the human being is object has tremendous extension in Heschel's theology. As the very title of his God in Search of Man is meant to indicate, Heschel's notion of divine subjectivity implies not just divine knowledge, but divine concern. I quote from the prophets, "God looks at the world and is affected by what happens in it. Man is the object of His care and judgment. The basic features of pathos and the primary content of the prophet's consciousness is a divine attentiveness and concern," end quote. Heschel's account of divine pathos suggests that God's very vision of the world entails care and judgment. The divine subject is affected by what happens in the world, and as a result, divine subjectivity, as we will see, ultimately makes a claim on human beings to act in a certain way in the light of that divine concern. I want to look closely at how Heschel understands the experience of being an object of divine subjectivity. And this is a central theme in his account of prophecy. I quote, Unlike the mystic's experience of man's turning towards God, the prophetic act is God's turning towards man, end quote. As a result, Heschel asserts, I quote again, prophetic experience is the experience of a divine experience, end quote. So what does it feel like to experience oneself as the object of divine experience? Such an experience entails, first of all, the loss of subjectivity. I'm no longer the I whom, at every other conscious moment of my life, I know myself to be. I'm still there where my I just was, but I'm no longer at one with myself, no longer the master of my experience, no longer the narrator of my own story. Rather, I experience myself as I am experienced by others. Heschel writes, I quote, "The prophet is in the midst of a divine event, an event in the life of God," end quote. I find myself subsumed into a narrative that so transcends my selfhood that I barely recognize myself within it. Heschel offers insight into how he conceives of the experience of being experienced when he describes prophecy as, I quote, "an act of being experienced, of being exposed to, called upon, overwhelmed, and taken over by him who seeks out those whom he sends to mankind," end quote. As the experience of being an object of God's subjectivity, prophecy entails a feeling of exposure, of being seen for all that one is, regardless of what one may wish to hide, and a feeling of being in another's power, of having one's selfhood taken over. At the same time, it entails being tasked with a mission towards which the divine subject strives. As such, the very experience of having one's subjectivity taken over, we shall see, ends up empowering the human being. This experience of being God's object at the center of prophecy, Heschel suggests, is an experience the religious person strives to have. I quote, "What they crave is to be wholly possessed by him, to be an object of his knowledge and to sense it," end quote. Let me now show how experiencing oneself as the object of divine subjectivity in fact points to a special kind of human agency, in Heschel's view, one in which human subjectivity becomes an expression of or an extension of divine subjectivity itself. That the prophet's subjectivity is not her own, but is rather an extension of God's, is clear from the very way Heschel describes the prophet's vision and judgment of the world. The prophet, says Heschel, has no direct account of the world to offer. Rather, I quote, "The main task of prophetic thinking is to bring the world into divine focus. He does not take a direct approach to things. It's not a straight line spanning subject and object, but rather a triangle, through God to the object. The prophet does not judge the people by timeless norms, but from the point of view of God," end quote. When the prophet expresses judgment over people in the world, Heschel suggests here, he does so from God's own point of view, because he sees the world through the divine lens, sharing in the divine vision of the world. Occupying or participating in divine subjectivity on Heschel's account likewise involves sympathizing with divine feeling. The prophet is guided, Heschel writes, quote, "not by what he feels, but rather by what God feels," end quote. Recognizing other human beings as created in the image of God and loving them as such, Heschel writes, quote, "is a love of what God loves, an act of sympathy, of participation in God's love." At the foundation of his account of human action as fulfilling or extending divine subjectivity, Heschel offers a remarkable ontology of human existence. In Man is Not Alone, Heschel writes, quote, "To be is to stand for a divine concern," end quote. I take Heschel to mean this statement in a double sense. On the one hand, that which has standing in the world, is an object, a Gegenstand, if you will, of divine concern. But the human being has the capacity, and hence the responsibility, to stand for divine concerns, to love those whom God loves, to stand up for those for whom God cares. Heschel understands the task of the human being to be just this, standing for divinity in the world, actualizing divine subjectivity through human agency. It's in this vein that Heschel writes, quote, "The true aspiration is not that self and all that is contained in it may last, but that all the self stands for may last. Man can be a nightmare, but also a fulfillment of a vision of God. He's been given the power to surpass himself, to answer for all things, and to act for one God," end quote. Note the transition the self is asked to undergo under divine auspices. He is asked, as it were, to give up his self, to give up the aspiration that his own subjectivity may last, and make himself into the agent of standing for divine concern. By doing so, Heschel suggests, the human being surpasses her own human subjectivity, given up in the experience of being object of God, and acts for one God, becomes an agent of God's will. Recalling the imagery of God follows me everywhere, Heschel claims the human being can be a nightmare, but also a fulfillment of a vision of God. Just as the speaker of the poem reverses his direction of sight to trace the path of divine vision from God's gaze looking after him, forward to that vision's fulfillment, so here Heschel sees the task of human life as that of fulfilling God's vision in the world. It seems to me that one may argue that this view of human beings as tasked with fulfilling the vision of divine subjectivity serves as nothing less than the theological foundation for both Heschel's approach to interreligious dialogue and his civil rights commitments. What unites us, Heschel asks in his No Religion is an Island? He answers, quote, "Our being accountable to God, our being objects of God's concern," end quote. And in his 1963 Religion and Race, Heschel writes, quote, "Equality of all men is not due to man's innocence or virtue. Equality of man is due to God's love and commitment to all men," end quote. That is to say, the basis for interreligious dialogue is that we all, despite our religious differences, are objects of the same divine subject, while our commitment to the struggle for equal rights depends upon our taking up God's perspective and actualizing divine love and commitment to all in our own agency. Heschel offers a vivid account of the theosocial consciousness of a religious person committed to charity in Man is Not Alone. I quote again, "In aiding a creature, he is helping the Creator. In succoring the poor, he fulfills a concern of God. Ascending by this ladder, the pious man reaches the state of self-forgetfulness, for he realizes that it is the will of God that matters and not his own perfection or salvation. Thus, the glory of man's devotion to the good becomes a treasure of God on earth," end quote. I want now to look at a remarkable example in which Heschel presents the two aspects of the human side of his theology of divine subjectivity as a single process. In his 1959 Prayer as Discipline, Heschel's view of the necessity of human self-effacement before God leads him to question the account of the relationship between God and human being as a dialogue. And in a clear poke at Buber's I and Thou, Heschel writes, quote, "Prayer begins as an it-he relationship." That is not I-thou, but rather an it-he relationship. Who are we to enter a dialogue with God? It is not as an I that we approach God, but rather through the realization that there is only one I, end quote. The precondition for an I-thou dialogue in Buber's terms, of course, are that I bring to my relationship with another both the whole of my first-person being and an openness to the whole second-person being of another. Heschel's question here, who are we, implies that the human being is not worthy of retaining full subjectivity in the face of divine subjectivity. But we've seen Heschel formulate this claim in even stronger fashion. I cannot grasp God as subject without grasping myself as object, as an it. Grasping myself as it is one and the same as grasping that there is only one I. Now, to say that prayer begins as an it-he relationship is to suggest that becoming an object before God's subjectivity is the start of a process. And indeed, Heschel proceeds to identify this starting point as a special discovery of prayer. I quote, "In prayer, the I becomes an it. This is the discovery. What is an I to me is, first of all and essentially, an it to God. The closer to the presence of him, the more obvious becomes the absurdity of the I," end quote. Heschel says here that the I becomes an it in prayer. But given his earlier formulation, I think we should say on his behalf that prayer begins with the discovery that my I is an it to God. The reality of this discovery becomes more intense as prayer intensifies, such that the absurdity of my being an I in the face of divine subjectivity only becomes more obvious, in Heschel's terms. But this process of self-effacement in prayer doesn't continue into infinity. Heschel now asks in the continuation of this discussion, I quote, "How does man become a person, an I? By becoming a thought of God. Man lives on earth as a self, but also as an object of divine concern. Such discovery is the reward of prayer," end quote. As the process of worship unfolds, we see, Heschel envisions a point of transformation. I surrender myself in prayer, discover that my I is the object of divine subjectivity. But at the depth of this discovery, I find the foundations for a new subjectivity. I become an I once again. I do so, just as we've come to expect, by recognizing myself as an object of divine concern, and as such, as an agent of that concern in the world. What's remarkable here is that Heschel presents what we've learned to recognize as the two sides of human existence before divine subjectivity as moments in the unfolding of a single discovery, a single spiritual exercise in which we recognize God as the only I, accept our identity as object before divine subjectivity, and then take up our I-hood in the service of that divine subjectivity in the world. I'm coming to a close in just a second. In the Prophets, Heschel depicts the insight into the human being's identity as object of divine subjectivity as a great secret. And I quote, "The great secret is God's hidden pathos, a divine concern unnoticed or forgotten hovers over the history of mankind. It is living in the perpetual awareness of being an object of the divine subject. This is the most precious insight, to experience oneself as a divine secret," end quote. God's subjectivity, we've learned, is a subjectivity concerned with its objects. But that concern can go unnoticed. It can be forgotten. We can become indifferent or unaware that we are objects of the divine subject. To experience oneself as a divine secret is to recognize the divine concern that is often hidden in the world, and, we've learned, to recognize oneself as standing for such concern, as an agent of divine concern. Our task, as Heschel understands it, is to reveal the divine secret that we are through our treatment of others in the world, by which we extend divine subjectivity. It's the revelation of this secret, I take it, that is at stake in the closing lines of the poem composed by a young Heschel with which we began. I quote, "Oh, it is only with the backs of the pupils of one's eyes that one can see how secrets come into being, how visions happen." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pollock, for this very, very clear presentation that shows how the human being is shifted when he or she enters into God's thought, feelings, care, will. You stayed only on the side of Heschel, but this certainly resonates very strongly, not only with Christian theology, but even probably more with Christian spiritual experience or Christian mysticism. So you really opened the door for this direction. Thank you so much. And now we have the pleasure of listening to our second speaker, Professor Suzanne Heschel. So we were happy to have Professor Heschel with us for her academic expertise. She is the L.E.M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses essentially on Jewish and Protestant thought in the 19th and 20th century. Includes the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, the history of anti-Semitism. I could continue on one, but and of course it was also a great pleasure to have Professor Heschel with us as the daughter of the person we are celebrating during this year and this particular day. It relates us to Abraham Heschel in a very special way. So it's a treasure to have you with us, and we're very happy to listen to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Etienne Veto. And I want to thank Rector Father Mark Lewis and Rector Rabbi Ariel Stoffenmacher and my colleagues who are here, Archbishop Giacomo Morandi and Professor Benjamin Pollock and Father Miroslav Rubel, and especially my father's close friend who is with us, Professor Elena Mortara, who was my father's translator when he lectured here in Italy and who often came to our home and who has translated much of my father's writings. It's a pleasure to have you with us here, Elena. I thank you for this conference honoring my father. I have him in my heart and I bring him to you, and I appreciate this commemoration of him. How does a Jew speak of Christianity to Christians after the Shoah? I quote the philosopher Judith Butler, "We stand at the limits of available ontologies, available schemes of intelligibility. How is it that the abject come to make their claim through and against the discourses that have sought their repudiation?" Remarkably, the Shoah did not alienate my father from Christianity, nor leave him abject, bitter, or angry, but instead convinced him that we must come together. Nazism has suffered a defeat, he writes, but the task for all of us is saving the radiance of the Hebrew Bible, the presence of God, the ongoing effort to break through the callousness of human beings. Our conscience, he writes, our conscience is mute as a wall. The martyrs do not need our recitations of Kaddish, but perhaps we need someone to recite Kaddish over us for us because we have lost our souls. Who is the we? The bystanders? The opposite of good is not evil, he writes. The opposite of good is indifference. The warm reception of my father's work among Christians, especially among Catholics, is an extraordinary development in the history of the West. How did this come about? Professor Joshua Fernall has emphasized, quote, without Rabbi Heschel, it is doubtful that Nostra Aetate would have taken the shape that it did. I marvel at my father's close friendships with individual Christian theologians and the range of people. Both Cardinal Bea and Dan and Philip Berrigan, Thomas Merton, Leo Rudloff, and Richard John Newhouse, Dorothy Day, and Monsignor Felix Morlian. Protestants as well, especially my father's colleagues at Union Theological Seminary, especially W.D. Davies, the great New Testament scholar, and pastors, including Martin Luther King Jr., William Sloane Coffin, and Albert Clegg. Astonishing is that Reinhold Niebuhr, the most important American theologian of the 20th century, asked my father to deliver the eulogy at his funeral. They recognized that my father had profound respect for Christianity and their relationships were profound. And I hope you realize how astonishing it is that my father, who came from an intensely pious Hasidic family in Warsaw, would appreciate his friendships with Christians. During the years when my father was involved in consultations with Vatican representatives about Nostra Aetate, he was also deeply engaged in the civil rights movement, which was also an ecumenical movement. Imagine what it meant for my father, after living in Germany from 1927 to 1938, to meet Christian theologians who had deep respect for Judaism. When my father was living in Germany, there were some Protestant theologians who wanted to throw the Old Testament out of the Christian Bible, saying it was a Jewish book. There were those who said that Jesus was not a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan, a German born in Schleswig-Holstein. Some called Hitler a Christ figure. Bishop Ludwig Müller rewrote the Sermon on the Mount to make it more militaristic. Theologians rewrote the Gospels. And then in America, my father met the Black church that regarded the Exodus and the prophets as central to Christianity. From the moment my father and Dr. King met in January of 1963, they became close friends. They often lectured together, and they ultimately joined together in protesting the war in Vietnam as a war crime. Despite their radically different backgrounds, their theological affinities are notable. What brought them together? The radiance of the Bible, the prophets, and prayer. And others had a similar sense about my father. Following their first meeting in November 1961, Cardinal Bea sent my father this note, quote, a strong, common spiritual bond exists between us. Let us remember that such friendships are rare in our history. The pastors, priests, and nuns who came to our home for Shabbat dinner and for Passover Seder were deeply moved by my father's prayers at the table. As a child, I could see the awe they experienced listening to my father and feeling Shabbat in our home. I think they realized that they had something to learn about God from Judaism. How do we foster a spiritual relationship? Show us how you pray, asked the monks at the Benedictine Weston Priory in Vermont when my father visited. Our words of prayer may differ, but our praying is the same. First we praise, then we believe. Yes, we differ in law and creed, but we are united in being objects of God's concern. Our language may be different, but the embarrassment is the same, and so is the sigh, the fear and trembling, and the conscience. My father spent the years of World War II alone in Cincinnati, teaching at Hebrew Union College, which had obtained the visa that saved his life. He desperately tried to save his mother, 3 sisters, relatives, and friends who were trapped in Europe, and he was appalled by the indifference to their fate among Jews as well as Christians. As he later recalled, he pleaded. He marched in demonstrations, all to no avail. No one would listen. Quote, I was a stranger in this country. My opinion had no impact. I was called a mystic, not a realist. I recited psalms, fasted, and cried myself out. The books of a theologian are a window into the author's soul. And we come to know my father through his writings. Quote, we all have a terrible loneliness in common, he writes in a 1942 article, An Analysis of Piety. Quote, the root of religion is the question what to do with the feeling for the mystery of living, what to do with awe, wonder, or fear. Religion is the end of isolation, begins with the consciousness that something is asked of us. Life is not a gift. Life is a mandate. Life is time. And the question he asked himself was, what does God want from me? What does the world need from me at this time? He felt he could not live in isolation, neither as a Hasidic Rebbe nor as a scholar removed from the problems of the world. During those war years, my father wrote several articles on piety and prayer. In one, he writes, prayer starts where expression fails. We live in longing, hoping to escape the world, even our own thoughts, to find ourselves. Not a soliloquy nor a dialogue. Prayer is an endeavor to become an object of God's thought. God loves what is left over at the bottom of the heart and cannot be expressed in words. It is the ineffable feeling which reaches God rather than the expressed feeling. God is not alone when we abandon God. We are alone. My father compares praying and dreaming. Psalm 126 begins, when God brought back those who returned to Zion, we were like dreamers. My father writes, to pray is to dream in league with God, to envision God's holy visions. The ability to pray, he says, is a response to loneliness. It is a gift from God and changes our lives. Psalm 66, thanks God. Blessed be God, who has not taken away from me the ability to pray, nor withheld his grace from me. Even more, the psalmist writes that in praying, I become prayer. Psalm 109, Ani tefillah, I am prayer. Prayer is not about seclusion or withdrawal from the world, my father writes. Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and to ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism, falsehood. God is in need of us. And so my father in 1965 went to the famous march in Selma, Alabama for voting rights. And he returned and he wrote in his diary, for many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling. And yet, our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. You can see immediately the profound connections that my father would have with Dorothy Day or Thomas Merton, Dr. King, and also Pope Francis. My father used to say that Judaism and Christianity need more of Jerusalem and less of Athens, and he mirrored in his own philosophy so much of what he had learned of the apophatic and the cataphatic. Ultimately, he was concerned less with doctrinal formulations than with creating a new spirit, an ability to perceive God's presence. But I have to say that the Nazi era also marks a shift in my father's writings on Christianity. His doctoral dissertation, which he finished in December 1932 from the University of Berlin, dissertation on prophetic consciousness, includes a sharp repudiation of German Protestant biblical scholarship, a topic that he then abandoned. His tone changed. His post-war writings, my father has no interest in medieval debates about whether the Trinity is idolatry, nor does he try to justify Jewish rejection of Jesus, nor was he intimidated by the injunctions of Rabbi Norman Lamb or Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who had condemned any Jewish engagement with Christians in dialogue. Nor did he join Martin Buber, who proclaimed Jesus as my brother. Nor did my father participate in the popular modern Jewish effort to claim Jesus for Judaism and blame Paul for creating Christianity. There is no tone of apologetics in his work, no effort to appease Luther, Kant, Troeltsch, or other critics of Judaism. When he discusses some of the Christian theological traditions that negate Judaism, he writes that they diminish Christianity itself. He was with Gustav Weigel the night before Weigel's untimely death, and he asked him, "Is it really the will of God that there be no more Judaism in the world? Would it be really ad majorem Dei gloriam to have a world without Jews?" And he tells Jews to be grateful for Christianity, for preserving Jewish texts, and for creating the field of modern scholarship on the Bible, for bringing the Bible and the God of Abraham to the world, and for Christian theologians who have been a source of inspiration for Jews. Over and over, he cites only what is said in positive terms about Christianity in the writings of Jewish thinkers through the centuries. Maimonides, he cites, only in teaching that Christianity and Islam are part of God's design for the redemption of humanity. Christians may interpret Torah differently, but they believe and profess that the Torah is God's revelation. My father cites at length, toward the end of his lecture, No Religion is an Island, the work of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, an 18th century rabbi in Altona, which then was part of Denmark, and who wrote startlingly positive appreciations of Christianity and Islam. Emden writes that Jesus brought a double goodness to the world. He strengthened the Torah of Moses majestically. And not one of our sages spoke out more emphatically concerning the immutability of the Torah. My father quotes Emden as saying that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are a community for the sake of heaven. Now, my father's writings appeared in the United States after World War II in an era that I have to say a word about. My father was uncomfortable with developments in American Judaism in that time. I think he would be very happy to see what has changed since then. It was a period when American Jews were immersed in Mordechai Kaplan's essentially Jewish version of the Chicago School of Theology. In those days, American Jews wanted to modernize and secularize. People were sure that orthodoxy was coming to a quick end, if not religion altogether. Sociologists like Peter Berger told us the sacred canopy was shattered. Psychoanalysts warned us that religion was a form of unhealthy masochism. My father was a distinctly new voice, very different, more deeply rooted in all the sources of Judaism No other Jewish theologian knew the vast range of classical Jewish texts that he did. But that also made him strange to Jewish readers who had no idea that the Talmud included theological debates about Revelation, or that Kabbalistic Tamei Mitzvot, reasons for the commandments, stemmed from rabbinic understanding of Tzorach Gavoha, of a divine need. That God needs redemption is integral to the Talmud and to the liturgy. Yet such deviation from an Aristotelian omnipotent God seemed heretical to some Jews. And yet, divine pathos, that God suffers with human beings, was very congenial for Black theologians in the United States, whose understanding of the prophets comes closest to my father's thought. Those who are aware of racism understand the prophet's condemnation of disavowal that my father emphasizes. To those police who claim that they are not racist and yet murder Black people, enacting the very racism that they disavow, Isaiah says, "You feel secure in your wickedness. You say, 'No one sees me.' You say in your heart, 'I am and there is no one beside me.'" Yes, those who exploit and cheat, bringing financial disaster. Politicians who say they believe in the right to life and yet deny the basic needs to sustain life: food, medical care, a home, education. To those, my father reminded, Jeremiah says, "On your shirt is found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor. Yet in spite of all these things, you say I am innocent. Behold, I will bring you to judgment for saying I have not sinned." That was my father's message. The callousness, mendacity, indifference. My father said, "We live in a godless world. If we still have a heart, it is turned to stone." He said, "I often sit and wonder. Perhaps our souls went up in flames with their bodies in Majdanek and Auschwitz." My father's central hope was that the Catholic Church would come to recognize the holiness in Judaism as a source of blessing for Christians. Yet the holiness of Judaism can only be recognized if the Church abandons proselytism and instead understands Jews as standing in unbroken covenant with God. And yet that holiness, my father said, also requires a revitalization of Judaism itself. He was tremendously critical of American Jewish life, not just secularism, but also the superficiality of so many rabbinical sermons, the passivity of congregants in synagogues, the absence of gravitas, the vulgarity of some bar mitzvah celebrations. He described the large, new suburban synagogues built after World War II as cemeteries where prayer goes to die. Isn't that great? People just sit back passively and they let the rabbi do the praying for them. Religion declined in the modern world, my father writes on page 1 of God in Search of Man, not because of the challenges of science and philosophy, but because the message became insipid. Jews are messengers who have forgotten the message, he said. How are we to recover? He points out that no religion is an island. During the course of history, when Christians have been pious, their Jewish neighbors have also been pious because we affect each other. Quote, "Spiritual betrayal on the part of one of us affects the faith of all of us. We do not live in isolation. We must choose between interfaith and internihilism. The supreme issue," he said, "is whether we are alive or dead to the challenge and the expectation of the living God." The crisis engulfs all of us. The misery and fear of alienation from God make Jew and Christian cry together. So how can we help one another? want to say a word, if I may, about my father's relationship with Cardinal Bea. Do I have 5 minutes? It was a very intense relationship, though.
It will make time fly by.
My father first met Cardinal Bea in Rome in 1961, and I'm not sure if they knew at that time that they both had studied at the University of Berlin with the same professor of Semitics, Eugen Mittwoch. Bea in 1913, my father in 1927. And as you may know, Cardinal Bea was a theologian concerned with revelation and divine inspiration, and was also a scholar of the Hebrew Midrashic commentaries, including on the Song of Songs, which is a text about revelation. My father gave him a gift, a special edition of the Midrash Shir HaShirim, and in that Midrash, Rabbi Akiva famously said that the whole world, olam, world, is not as important as the moment when the Song of Songs was given to Israel. And at that meeting, my father suggested that the word olam might be translated as time. Time. We have a prophetic responsibility to time, my father said, to recognize what is vital in a particular moment. My father was asked by Cardinal Bea to prepare a memorandum, and he did. He stated, my father, 4 points for the Second Vatican Council. First, to reject deicide, to stop missionary activity, to expose Christians to Jewish religious life, and to establish a church commission to stop prejudice and nurture Christian-Jewish relations. When Cardinal Bea came to the United States in March of 1963, they also had a special meeting, and Cardinal Bea also acknowledged my father's memorandum. At that meeting, and there was a dinner that evening at the Plaza Hotel, my father addressed Cardinal Bea, and he said, "What will save us? What will save us? God and our ability to stand in awe of each other's faith, of each other's commitment. This is the agony of history, bigotry, the failure to revere each other's faith. We must insist upon loyalty to the unique treasures of our own tradition and at the same time acknowledge that in this eon, religious diversity is the will of God." I want to just finally say, it's important for me to let you know, in conclusion, that my father was also open strongly to change. We cannot all be religious in the same way, he believed. It is the will of God that we express our faith in different ways. And even within Judaism, he supported pluralism. His final book was a study of the Kotzker Rebbe, who stressed that our Judaism must be authentic to who we are. We have to know who we are. My father writes that to imitate the faith of others, even our own grandparents, that would be, he says, spiritual plagiarism, a great phrase. Indeed, although I was raised in a home that was faithfully Shomer Mitzvot, observant of the commandments, my father suggested to me that I become a rabbi. I didn't think that would ever happen. He said, times are changing. And he arranged a bat mitzvah for me that I wanted. Now, there is a debate in the Talmud between 2 rabbis, Rav and Shmuel, as to whether the world was created for the sake of Moses so that he might receive the Torah, or whether the world was created for the sake of David so that he might sing hymns and psalms in praise of God. The answer, of course, is that the world was created for the sake of both Scripture and Psalms. And we might ask a similar question about the goals of theological scholarship and even the purpose of a lecture. Do we become scholars in order to receive and transmit scripture, our research findings? Or do we become scholars in order to sing psalms? That is, to inspire ourselves and others to become attuned to the wonder that is the beginning of faith. So Moses says in Deuteronomy 32, "Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak. Let the earth listen to the words of my mouth." And the rabbis explain that at that moment, Moses stood in heaven and spoke simultaneously to heaven and to earth. So perhaps we might remember that dialogue is not just carried out among ourselves. God is present and listening. After all of our lectures and publications and conferences and dialogues, may God hear what is perhaps the inexpressible longings of our hearts, and may our dialogue be filled with psalms and become itself prayer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was moving. It was also very, very rich. I just underlined one point. It could have underlined many more, is how neighbors influence each other. When you have pious Jews, you have pious Christians, you have pious Jews. That seems to be a very central point. And of course, thank you for the beautiful conclusion. You have managed both to transmit us scripture and to make us want to sing psalms. So we now will have the joy of listening to Archbishop Morandi. This will be in Italian. And so Archbishop Morandi has been professor of sacred scripture in Modena. And so a theologian and a biblist. He served as the undersecretary and then the secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And is now a bishop of Reggio Emilia Guastalla. And if I may, I don't know if you are going to speak about this, but one of the reasons why we thought about you is because one day you had told me that when you were, I think it was in minor seminary, and you were in a moment in which theology seemed very arid, and you started reading Heschel in the evening, I don't know, at night even, and developed a taste for scripture. And this is what guided you all your life. And so Heschel was a turning point in your own experience. So thank you for what you're going to be able to tell us.
I am very grateful to be able to offer a very modest contribution to the person and to the work of Abraham Heschel, whom I consider one of the most significant and extraordinary spiritual figures of the 20th century. Let me confess that I accepted this invitation with some trepidation, being well aware of the depth and breadth of a thought which is so rich in inspiration, suggestions, provocations, and which, after so many decades, still retains all its freshness, vitality, and even topicality. Now, if I accepted, it is out of a debt of gratitude and recognition, because as we heard from Father Vetto, I did in fact meet with Heschel since his years of theological studies in preparation of the presbyterate. And as it was, as they say, this was a sort of a love at first sight. And after reading the book, The Message of the Prophets, I literally devoured all of his writings, which to this day are to me a source of inspiration, reflection, and also of great consolation. Because yes, I do believe that one of the immediate effects that the reading of Heschel's writings provokes in the heart of those who read it is exactly the one of consolation, great consolation, and spiritual consolation mostly. You access a world where you are sort of isolated from triviality and routine, and you immerse yourself in that world where you are involved by the divine pathos, which changes you deeply. And it is the way through which you read and interpret your life and history. Now, it may seem strange that for a seminarian about to become a Catholic priest, a presbyter, and like a Catholic bishop like me, Heschel may stand as a spiritual and pastoral inspiration. Even all the more so, I was for 5 years secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, just to be clear. Now, I am now ready to explain my gratitude because Paul VI, in the last meeting, he writes how the last meeting was with Paul VI. And it was very important because he writes that when the Pope saw me, this is what he writes, he smiled, full of joy, with a radiant face. He grasped my hand, and he did so with both hands. He did that more than once. And he started a conversation by saying that he was reading my books and that he found them highly spiritual and beautiful, and that a Catholic should always read them. So I am in good company, in other words. Now, I am ready to explain my gratitude, and I must say that I accepted this invitation because there was a possibility of meeting you, the daughter of Abraham Heschel, and to say how grateful I am for having a father that was so inspiring and great. And in the time that I was given, I will just highlight some of the pathways amongst the many possible pathways that allow us to explore Heschel's reflection and how that can stand as a reason of inspiration for a believer, a Christian believer. This is only some of the pathways that can be highlighted. Now, the first one, which I believe is important, is the one establishing the relationship between relationship between theology and depth theology. In the essay on depth theology, Heschel addresses the relationship between theology and depth theology that really raised so many debates and gave rise to so many readings and interpretation. And to me, this seems to be a very first significant contribution. Heschel writes that to the outside observer, the religious existence seems to consist exclusively of two components: the ritual and the myth, the sacrament and the dogma, action and scripture. The importance of these elements, goes on Heschel, is beyond dispute. For some, the truth of religion consists in a ritual. For others, religion consists of its own dogma. But then he adds that there is another dimension, a vital dimension that escapes the observer, and that is the one that goes on within the person, which he calls the interiority of religion. The innerness of the ritual, the myth, and the dogma, and the action remain exteriorities if there is no response that springs out from within the person. That is a moment of identification and penetration that internalizes them. And then, still in the same essay, he specifies that the subject of theology is the content of the faith, while the subject of theology of the Depth is the act of believing. In the first case, we speak of creed, dogma, and in the second one of faith. Belief and faith, theology and depth theology are in a relationship of mutual dependence. I believe that to all of us, the theologians, it is clear that every faithful Christian is immediately finding himself in the famous fides quae creditur and fides qua creditur, the former designating the content of faith and the latter the act of believing. And though that theology of the depth theology is even more complex, we can't really talk much about it, but it allows us to see that Heschel recognizes the need for a mutual dependence, which without the one becomes a mere exteriority, and dogma turns into a god. This is a very strong sentence, especially because man preferred to believe in dogmas rather than in God. That's a disaster. Whilst the second one transforms into spiritual narcissism and becomes and turns into the catacomb of subjectivism. I believe that Heschel has some expressions that have the ability of penetrating words. It's just depth bombs that are exploding in the depths of the ocean. Now, the two spheres, according to Heschel, are in a mutual relationship, reciprocal relationship, and theology should teach us, for example, whether the world is made by God or it is an emanation of His being, or whether the world is from God or a creation of His will. The depth theology must guide us along the path that leads to gaining experience both of our own self and of the world in the light of the teaching that we receive, by translating thought into prayer. And that turns the doctrine into a personal reaction or response to grasp a mystery as a challenge. A problem is seen as an appeal to our own deepest selves. And if there is no such passage, that's a true disaster. Now, he concludes, is what allows us to maintain the right balance between mystery and meaning, between silence and forms of expression, between sacred respect and action. This, according to Heschel, is the goal of the religious experience. This polarity, to lend an expression dear to our author, is extremely fruitful for the theological thinking and believing thinking, and especially for a Christian who acknowledges and recognizes that all theological thinking is embedded within a relationship, a vital relationship, but not with an object, rather with a manifesting subject. The pages having to do with divine pathos are a masterpiece, and I've heard the debate, and I believe that when I started teaching the course on prophets, there was a whole part devoted to this reflection, the Heschel's reflection, whereby the homo sympatheticus can penetrate the divine pathos. Now, after all, Jesus asked to the disciples to share a life that progressively allowed to disclose his identity. Access to the contents of faith that we name dogma, that we call dogma, happens or takes place through a life that is shared and is experienced in a very clear way. This is how Heschel ends, and I would not, as he says, I would not enter the precincts of religions through the door of discourse. The way to God passes through the depths of the self. The soul is the key. The depth is the door. In the depth of the soul, there is prayer, invocation, pleading, begging for meaning, yearning for justification. And then there is another thing. There is only one form, one legitimate form of religious expression, that is prayer. Now, this is what made me think of the beautiful aphorism of Heraclio Ponticus. If you are a theologian, you will truly pray. And if you truly pray, you will be a theologian. Well, that's it. And it's true. And then this brought to my mind another idea of Don Diego Barsotti, a mystic priest. And he always said, or used to say, that the church was fighting, always, fighting the reduction of his own faith down to theology, but was always identifying it into liturgy, because in liturgy it unveils its theology, the entire theology, its entire faith. Prayer, because it is a subject that is always revealed and that becomes manifest. So the depth theology may stand as a great help, and I'm thinking of the many pages of the Apostle Paul and the letter to the Romans, which is the one having to do with faith. It would be really interesting to look at it. Now, a new way of reading the scripture, which is holding for the Christian. In the essay, Religion in a Free Society, Heschel offers a new approach to the one who is approaching the reading and the meditation of the Bible, the Holy Scripture, and the Word of God. And he then goes on by saying something which is very simple, but at the same time very profound and deep. So Heschel identifies the most serious obstacle encountered by man in entering to the debate about the ideas of the Bible, and that is the absence from his own consciousness of the many issues to which the same scripture itself seems to be referring. The Bible is a sublime answer, but we no longer know the question it answers. Now, if we do not rediscover the question, we have no hope of understanding the scripture. The Bible is the answer to this question: what does God want from man? And for modern men, this question has been replaced by another one: what does man ask of God? Modern man continues to ponder, what will I get out of life? The fundamental question escapes to his attention, which instead has been forgotten. That is, what will life obtain from me? This is what changes the position. And when he publishes the text on prophets, he is going to change his life. That's when his life changes, because from that very moment he says, I'm going to leave behind the world, and I will start with the commitment, the social commitment. And this reversal of perspective directly involves the believer, who is called upon to realize that in the word that he received, he also receives an appeal that radically changes the way of approaching God and the world and relating to God and the world. And here we see an analogy in between the experience of the disciples in the Gospels, where the disciples realize that Jesus is the answer to their own expectations. But they also, in the long run, understood that that call and that involvement, which is the divine pathos, was making them accountable towards the many that would come to know Jesus through them. So in the end, they understood that Jesus needed them. The disciple then is to allow for the presence in the world, the same compassion of Jesus. And I believe that this is very important, because in our world, the one I have come to know, it is always the perspective of reading the scripture so as to draw some spiritual consolation. That's the right thing to do, but at the same time, the scripture is also imposing to the reader to ask himself what God will get out of him, that is commitment, which is never to be given for granted. Then the other aspect, which I believe is relevant and important, is that the religion begins with the wonder and with the amazement. And in almost all of his writings, there is a paragraph. There are pages having to do with wonder and amazement, which represent the indispensable condition for the journeys of faith. In the work Man is Not Alone, he writes, the advancing of civilization almost necessarily entails the decline of the sense of wonder. And this fact is an alarming symptom of our mindset, of our state of mind. Humanity will never perish from the lack of information, but it will perish from the lack of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness is in realizing that a life without wonder is not worth living. And what we lack is not the will to believe, but rather the willingness to wonder, which is exactly what it is. And for Heschel, it is wonder rather than doubt that represents the source of knowledge, because doubts can be dissolved, whilst the radical astonishment is never to be erased. And I think that I can say that this dimension of wonder, being the source of knowledge and of our own thought, stands as a permanent indication which also permeates the New Testament and runs through it. The reaction of the crowds before the word and the signs of Jesus, the astonishment and the fear when the women are overwhelmed by the announcement of Easter, and again the wonder that is the leitmotif of the experience of the nascent church. And you probably know that in the Nativity, that is the Neapolitan Nativity, the most important figure or character of that Nativity is O Meraviglia, that is to say, the shepherd who, when facing the child, Christ, in the grotto, is amazed and astonished in wonder. And that figure is probably the most detailed and that can never be missing in the Nativity, the Neapolitan Nativity. But wonder is the very beginning. It is the beginning of everything. Do you remember maybe in the Henri de Lubac essay, the drama of the atheist humanism, this Jesuit then and theologian says, can you think of the wonder of the pagans and the astonishment of the pagans experience in the very moment when they were told that above them there was a Father and not destiny. So, astonishment, wonder again. And I wonder, and here I'm speaking for myself, I wonder whether all of us, the believers, are still capable of this awe and this wonder and feeling that we are so loved by the Father, by our God. If only we could stand and keep it still, we could just always feel the greatest joy. And here I'm going back to a wonderful book by Chesterton, The Adventures of a Living Man. That's a beautiful book, and in the end it says that the purpose of man is the one of reaching death by staying alive. But in order to do so, and to stay alive, you must never get used to the many gifts that we have, the gifts of God. Never give them for granted, because in the end we have to thank God for that awe, for this astonishment and marvel. I believe that this is an essential dimension because it allows for the path leading to faith.
La festa.
Finally, the feast day as the climax of life. In his book, The Shabbat, Heschel deals with another fundamental subject, which is a relationship with time, in particular the feast day. In the biblical spirit, Heschel writes, effort is a means to an end, and Sabbath, as the day of rest from work, was not created to recover lost energy and to make us capable of taking up the trials to come. It was created out of love for life. Man is not a beast of burden. The Sabbath is not there to improve efficiency at work. Last, created first in intentions, the Sabbath is the end of the creation of heaven and earth. Sabbath is not at the service of the other days which exist as a function of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but it is the climax of life. And further on, usually we believe that the earth is our mother, that time is money, and that profit is our companion. The seventh day reminds us that God is our Father, that time is life, and that the Spirit is our companion. I believe that these words need no comment, because they're so clear and explicit about the meaning of time and the meaning of the feast day. Man is made for the feast day. That's the way it is. I am completely in favor of this meaning of the feast day, which the Christian world also seems to have lost. We now speak of weekends, the end of the week, whereas it's the beginning. It's a substantial reversal, our way of conceiving of time. The feast day is seen as a break and not as the real purpose for which we were created. Man, in pursuit of God, also should consider that in the Hebrew world too there's a need to revivify the feast day. He writes, gathered in a synagogue, everything at its place, the body, benches, books, but the soul is missing. It's as if we were all suffering from spiritual absenteeism. And then he gives some example. We've done everything to revivify the Sabbath in the synagogue. We've had Boy Scout Sabbaths. We had the Sabbath where we recalled people's birthdays without saying how old they are, of course. And he goes on. It's as if we were suffering from spiritual absenteeism. We ask us, for example, how can we increase the number of people at the synagogue liturgy? We can't solve spiritual problems by resorting to management techniques. It is therefore not a matter of filling buildings, but inspiring hearts. And it is a difficulty to which it is difficult to apply the tools of commercial psychology. The problem is not presence in the synagogue, but spiritual presence. It's not so much a matter of attracting bodies into the temple, but to ensure that souls access an hour of spiritual concentration in the presence of God. There's that beautiful text he quotes of the rabbi who before coming into the presence of God embraces his wife and his children and says, I'm going to pray. I don't know whether I'll come back and how I'll come back. Once we used to say, I'm going to buy cigarettes. But in this case, I don't know whether I'll be coming back. The problem is time, not space. This is the point. And he said in Judaism, they're not great monuments, but great moments. Concluding my talk, which only aimed at giving some points for discussion among the many paths Heschel opened, I'd like to conclude with his words, which for me are a constant warning. As a believer, as a priest, as a bishop, God is not an explanation to the mysteries of the world or a guarantee for our salvation. He is an eternal challenge, an urgent request. He is not a problem to be solved, but a question put to us as individuals, as a nation, as humankind. God has no importance if he does not have absolute importance. This is something which I think should be a beacon for many decisions to be taken, personal ones and other ones too. This means the deep certainty that it is preferable to be defeated together with him than to be victorious without him. Thank you.